question I got. The person said this: I'm facing an onslaught of name-calling for simply stating my Christian convictions. How do you handle it in a winsome way? Can you give any personal examples that you have faced? What do we need to tell ourselves internally to quell the natural impulse to anger? Well, this is a great question, and I understand exactly how you feel. I also teach on a lot of controversial issues, and merely stating my convictions sometimes, even without any kind of a defense, puts me in a situation where people want to call me names. So let me give you 3 suggestions for how I handle it. The first is, I try to set my expectations. And obviously, if you're a Christian and you are speaking in the name of Christ and advancing a Christian worldview, you just have to expect and be prepared that you will endure persecution, name-calling, and ridicule. In fact, the Bible is clear in several passages, in fact, dozens of passages, where the Bible talks about how we as Christians, we will endure difficulty and persecution. Or in 1 Peter, where you see Peter saying, do not be surprised by the difficulty you're experiencing, as though something strange were happening to you. Okay, and so we see this all over Scripture where we shouldn't be surprised by this kind of behavior from the world. Okay? Obviously, the wisdom of God is foolishness to the world, so we should just have an expectation that this is what we are to, that we're going to be experiencing such kinds of persecution and name-calling. Okay? So just set that as in your mind as to what to expect first. The second thing that I do is that I see name-calling as a form of steamrolling. Now, if you're familiar with Stand to Reason and Greg's book on tactics and his work on that, you'll be familiar with the steamroller tactic, which is simply a way of dealing with people who oftentimes come at you with a tremendous amount of energy and hostility. And oftentimes when someone's calling you names, it's a similar kind of thing. They have a lot of energy and momentum, and they're directing it at you. And so the way I deal with someone who is calling me names is I often try to call out what they're doing and then try to negotiate a truce. So for example, I'll say, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. You seem to be just simply calling me names. This isn't really helpful for a discussion because name calling is just name calling, right? And that's not very productive. And so can we just skip that part and just talk about our respective views rather than calling me names? And so by doing this, of course, it's going to hopefully embarrass them a little bit, maybe bring a little bit of shame onto them. And it's not intended to be malicious, or you're not trying to be nasty about that. But you do want them to kind of recognize what they're doing is wrong by calling you names, and then agree to not do that in the future. Now, of course, if they continue to do that, then my suggestion would be, all right, then just let them have the last word and just say, okay, hey, thanks for sharing your point, and move on. But oftentimes when you point this out, they'll feel a sense of uneasiness or uncomfortableness and regret about doing that, and oftentimes they'll cooperate by stopping to call you names. So that's a second thing that I'd like to do. And the third thing I do is I use the Columbo tactic. And again, if you're familiar with Stand to Reason and Greg's work on tactics, you'll be familiar with this notion of asking questions instead of statements, which is what the Columbo tactic is about. And the first application of the Columbo tactic is intended to help you to gain information. And I use that tactic specifically when someone calls me a name. In fact, what I do is, and the tactic, by the way, is, what do you mean by that? That's the key question to ask with regards to this first application. And so when someone calls me a name, I ask them, what do you mean by that? Or I ask them to define for me the term that they just used. Now, the reason why I do this is because when they give the definition of that name that they just called you, it'll turn out that that definition either, 1, doesn't apply to you, or 2, if it applies to you, it also applies to them in some way, or 3, it doesn't matter that it applies at all. Okay, let me give you an example of each one of those. So oftentimes I'll be teaching on the topic of homosexuality, for example, and people will call me homophobic or say, well, you're just being homophobic. And so I'll ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Define for me homophobic. Again, I'm using the Columbo tactic here. Now, obviously, there's many different ways that people define the term homophobic, but let me just give you one example. People will say, well, Alan, you're just afraid of homosexuals. You just can't stand to be around them. You think they're nasty and you don't want anything to do with them. Now, here's an example where this clearly doesn't apply to me, because if this person was to know me, or oftentimes I'll just simply explain this, and I say, look, I have friends that identify themselves as gay or lesbian. I have family that identifies himself as gay or lesbian. I've had many of these people over at my house. I love them. I host them at my place. If you knew my life, or if you knew me personally, there's no way you could get away with saying that I'm homophobic in the sense of having this like irrational fear of being with people who identify as gay or lesbian. Okay? So there's an example where the term may just not even apply to you at all. But by asking for a definition, that gets brought up. Now, a second possible definition is one in which if it does apply to you, perhaps it also applies to them as well. And so oftentimes people will call me judgmental or narrow-minded or intolerant. And so I'll say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by narrow-minded? Could you define for me narrow-minded? Again, I'm using the Columbo tactic. And they'll say, well, by narrow-minded, I just simply mean you think you're right, and anyone who differs from you is wrong. I'll say, okay, well, I guess I do believe that I'm right, and if someone differs from me, then I'm wrong. But notice that this definition, although it applies to me, it also applies to them as well. I'll say, well, wait a minute, don't you think you're right? And they'll be like, yeah. I say, and I differ from you, so by definition, I'm wrong. Isn't that correct? They're like, yeah. I say, well, according to your definition then of narrow-minded, you would also be narrow-minded because I differ from you and you think you're right. And so therefore, according to that definition, you would also fit the bill. Right? So there's an example where sometimes that definition applies to you as well as to them. And that's the case, by the way, with being called judgmental or other kinds of words like that when moral relativism is being expressed. But then a third type of definition sometimes doesn't even really matter that it applies to you. So one example of this, I was teaching at a university, I think it was in Michigan, years ago, and I was asked to present the pro-life position to the university audience. So I was standing up on a stage, and since it was sort of like me against the university audience, and I got basically 20 minutes to make my case, and then I had to take any challenges from the audience. So with those 20 minutes, I presented a scientific defense for the full humanity of the unborn from the moment of conception. And then I took challenges. Now, after about a half an hour of challenges, people felt like they weren't making a lot of progress in terms of refuting the scientific claims I made. So finally, somebody stands up to the microphone and says, well, you're just anti-woman. Now, here's an example where it doesn't really matter whether that's true or not. And so here's what I said. I said, okay, let's just say you're right. Let's say you're right that I'm anti-woman, that I hate women. How does that affect the scientific defense that I just gave an hour ago, that the unborn is a human being from the moment of conception? It doesn't. If I'm anti-women and I hate women, it doesn't at all affect the scientific argument that I just presented, because my character or who I am has no bearing on the merits of that scientific defense. It's completely irrelevant. In fact, I could be anti-woman, I could be homophobic, I could be bigoted, I could be a Nazi, man, I could be Hitler himself. And it wouldn't affect the scientific defense that I just gave. Because that thing, that scientific defense, my argument, stands or falls on its own merits. And so that's why oftentimes when someone calls you a name, it just doesn't even matter. Because they're attacking me or my character rather than the argument itself. And so sometimes I just simply point that out, that that's what's happening. So that's what I do when I'm called names. One is I cite my expectations and realize that's just going to happen, so I'm not surprised by it. Number two, I recognize name calling as a form of steamrolling, and I try to call it out for what it is and negotiate a truce. And number three, I use the Columbo tactic to ask them to define for me the word they're using to call me names. And that oftentimes demonstrates that that's what they're doing. They're just calling me names. And it either will not apply to me, that definition. If it applies to me, it also applies to them. Or three, it doesn't matter that it applies at all.